Hello and welcome to Wrestling with Real Estate, where we look to chokeslam all your real estate problems. I'm your host, former WWE wrestler and now Cirque du Soleil performer, and of course, multi-family real estate investor, Barry Griffiths. Now today we're joined by Eric Nielsen again. Hey, Eric.
Hey, Barry. Good to be back, man. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thanks for coming back for part two. We had an awesome part one, which was a lot of fun and a lot of great stuff talked about. So if you guys want to go back and listen to the first part and get, more of the story behind where Eric is now and kind of what he's done, go and do that. But, before we dive into today's deep dive into the deal, that the 6 unit that you've done, do you want to give a high level introduction into yourself for someone who hasn't listened to the first part yet?
Yeah, for sure. And again, go back and listen to the first part because we have so many tips there. So thanks for having me again. Yeah, my name is Eric Nelson. I live in Colorado. We kind of went over this, but I started real estate, a little bit lucky, bought a house in college and sort of house hacked. Didn't really know what I was doing. Then bought a single family with my wife and we kind of long flipped that. And then, took some friends kind of pushing me into some other ideas. And so we started buying, more properties. And then we kind of lucked into this, not luck, no, it's not true, but got this sixplex we're about to talk about, and then opened my mind to partnerships and even syndication. So at the moment, we bought an 8plex recently in Texas and then looking to do larger deals with syndication. So that's kind of my super quick and dirty story.
Very cool. Well, yeah, you mentioned it there, the 6 unit. Let's dive right into it.
Okay.
What is the story in the sixplex? So you bought a sixplex it's in Colorado, right? What you touched on it before, but what made you want to buy a sixplex to start off with? Maybe tell people that, and then we can kind of
yeah, for sure. So we'll back up a little bit again. My wife and I, we spent some time on a single family that was a historic home, and we took some time to fix it up. And after a 2-year period or so, we sold it and made a pretty good profit on it. We had about $100,000, which again at the time was just a ton of money. And so my thinking was, kind of like a lot of people, is like $100,000 would be about a 20% down payment on about $500,000 place. So I was really looking for like 450, something like that, to leave a bit of money to fix it up. And it's my personality really to just like look everywhere. And so I would go for walks with my son, who was a baby at the time. And like, I would just push him in a stroller. Anytime I saw a for sale rent or a for sale sign, I would just call and just say, hey, what are you asking? And the for rent thing is a really good tip for your listeners too. Cause someone in that position, especially if they're like an owner renter, they have a vacancy, right? So they have a for rent sign out. And so what I would do is call and just say, hey, I'm not really looking to rent, but would you be interested to sell? And it's actually kind of amazing how many people would say, yeah, maybe, that kind of thing. But I didn't really have like one going per se. And so one day I'm walking my son down the street and there's this like sixplex and it's a historic home. And then there's like a quad behind it. And this guy was sitting there and truthfully, he looked tired. I mean, I told him that like, wow, hey, how you doing? Like just started a conversation. And I was like, do you own this place? He's like, yeah, I inherited it from my mom. Like, I'm just kind of tired of running it. He's like, I love it. And I just started the conversation. I was like, hey, I'm actually looking to buy, like just out of pure curiosity. I probably can't afford it, but what are you looking to sell it for? And he just blurted it out. He's like, well, I'd need like $1 million for it. And I was like, you know what? It sounded like you inherited it. Have you ever thought about like financing the property? And he was like, well, not really. I was like, well, it could be a pretty cool situation because you could get a check every month and you don't have to do any of the landlord stuff anymore. And it was like his eyes lit up, So he, I like slow rolled it because I don't want to dump everything on him at once. Like you could tell he'd thought about selling, but not like the details, right? So I was like, hey, well, think about it. Talk to your wife. Give me a shout. So we got to talking more and more. I went to coffee a couple times before I really laid this out. And I said, hey, here's the scoop: is I don't have enough down payment to buy the property, but you seem like someone who likes the idea of a bigger payment. So here's what I'd offer. And I kind of just said, how about a low down payment, which means that your mortgage is higher. And I did all the numbers for him. Basically, I was like, here's the payment that you can get for what I'm proposing. And what I told him was I could bring $35,000 down and a 40-year amortization on that 965, which made our payments lower, basically interest only. And we'll just pay every month and we'll own the property. And then, worst case scenario, if we ever default, you just get the property back. Was kind of the pitch I gave him. And he was like, yeah, sounds awesome. Let's do it. And, it took a little bit of time, again, like a couple of coffees, and then the relationship built for him to trust me and know me. And so we went for it. I called an attorney, and he wrote up the offer, and we met in his office. And even the attorney was like, hey, this is pretty low down payment. It's kind of a lot of risk as a seller type thing. But he's like, nah, I trust him. Like, we know each other now. We live in the same town, all this stuff. And part of it too, I think, was like really seeing this. I touched on this on the first part, was finding their need. What he needed was the monthly income. What he didn't want to do was the landlord stuff, and he didn't need a bunch of cash at the moment. For me, I needed a down payment and have some cash to like put some money into the property and have a little buffer, right? To buy the property. And so that was kind of the story, is like just walking by, taking a chance, talking to somebody, and then ultimately building the relationship, and then, figuring out what works for everybody. And that's kind of how we landed on that property. And since then, and then there's actually one more piece of the story I haven't told yet, was in the garage, there was a ton of stuff, and there was like this loft kind of thing above the garage. And as we're walking through there, I'm seeing that there's plumbing and electrical like already to this loft area, but it's filled with stuff. Like all of his mom's stuff was in there. All of his stuff was in his garages. And so I was like, dude, I didn't say this, but I was thinking I could rent this garage and I could finish out this unit, because there's actually 5 when I bought it. And so I did. I finished that out, and that's where the rest of our cash went to, is to like finish out that 6th unit. And so we rent the garages, and we rent all 6 units, and it cash flows pretty nicely.
Wow. What a cool story, right? Not only the owner financing thing, but just how you came about it, right? You were just out there walking. So that's so interesting to me. What, when you approached this guy, you knew he was the owner, or you were just guessing, or maybe trying your luck, or maybe just putting it out there?
Yeah. I mean, I kind of assumed either, this might sound like profiling, I guess, but I thought either he was kind of the handyman because he had like paint on him, or the owner. And so I just said, hey, like, do you own the property type thing? And it was also me being genuine. Like, he looked like he needed someone to talk to, if I'm being honest. Like, he was just sitting there kind of like defeated. Like, he just painted this property. He's like tired of it. And so I was just kind of like, hey, how's it going? And I had my son, who was a baby, was just like killing time. And I do enjoy talking to people. So there is more to it, right? But then once I found out he's the owner and he was tired of owning it, my mind went straight to like, how can I buy this? And the other thing we talked about in part 1 was like $1 million is just a large number, right? And so I had to have my wife's supportive friends to kind of push me off the top rope and say, like, you can do it.
Yeah. So when you met with this guy, like, did you know about how much? You must have known quite a bit about owner financing before. It wasn't that you'd listened to one podcast somewhere in the car one time. Seems like you knew how to pitch it, knew how to sort of frame it, and to make it seem like it would be a good thing for him. Had you done any research, or was it just stuff that you'd picked up along the way?
I think a little bit of both, right? So I had heard it on podcasts. I mean, you hear people talk about owner financing, stuff like that. So I had the like concept in my mind, but because this is kind of a good thing I did, was like, instead of just shouting a bunch of numbers at him right away, it took a few meetings and suggestions and thinking about it, before I really pitched it. And the other thing I did was like, I came prepared with like a couple of options. Like, here's one where like, if you sold it, here's what you get. And by the way, like, you're probably going to pay 6% in realtor fees, all that stuff. And so I had like a full picture of like, here's what you'd probably get on the market. Here's what I'm offering, and here's why it works for you. And then you also, because he inherited it, if he would have sold, he would have had a pretty big tax bill, right? Because like, let's say he clears $1 million, he's going to have to pay capital gains on likely $500,000 in that case. Not to get too far in the tax weeds, but to answer your question, it was like, I had the concept, I had the idea, but it really took me thinking about, what does that owner financing look like, and how can I pitch it to him that could work? And so I didn't really have it all figured out right away. Now I would. If I did it again, I might even botch it, because I might just throw all these numbers at him.
You might know too much, right? Yeah, sometimes that can be a problem. And then, so did you have? How do you know it was worth $1 million? He threw out the $1 million number. Was it worth more? Was it worth just $1 million? Maybe, how did you analyze the deal? How did you understand what it was worth? How did you understand what you could pay and where you'd feel comfortable with everything?
Yeah, I mean, that's an awesome question. I think first thing, when he threw $1 million out, because that's what he said early on, I was basically like, oh, well, pass. That's kind of like my mind was like, no, thanks. I can't afford that. But then I started looking at the market really, and there's some tools out there, right? Like Zillow has like an estimator. I looked at the tax assessment number, what they had. And then really what it came down to is like doing the math. And at this point, I really had finally understood what cash flow looks like, the rents coming in versus what's going out, that type of thing. So I would encourage listeners, like if they're going to buy a property, take the time to do the math, right? So I did the numbers on what everything rented for and what the mortgage would be. At the time I was going to manage it myself, so I didn't have that expense. I would encourage people to include that expense though, just in case that time does come when they want to hire a manager. But then I saw kind of the value add piece of it too. It's like, I can put this 6 unit in and I can rent that garage, and he's not seeing that, and I don't want to hide it from him, but he just wasn't in a place to even think like that. He just wanted to like kind of cruise on and collect checks. And so really doing the math of like, what's it going to cost to get there? What's it going to rent for? And what are my expenses? And I knew we could make money at $1 million, especially with the financing that we had proposed.
Yeah. And the 40-year amortization is a great idea, right? The longer you amortize, I'm having trouble with that word. Amortize.
Is that it's the hardest word in the world, dude. I get it wrong every time too. I just avoid it. Just say am.
Yeah, let's say 40-year am, is going to mean a lower down payment for you as well. And I'm surprised that he went for that, because the longer the payment goes out, right, the longer it takes for you to get that money back, and the less you get every year. But he was ready at that point. It seems like he was just almost ready just to get rid of and get that monthly payment, and was willing to agree to your terms. What kind of interest rate did you guys agree on?
We agreed on a 5.75, which a lot of your listeners might say that's crazy, but what I think he wanted was $1 million and a high interest rate. It was like his mind, right? Like that's what he wanted, and if he could get those two things, that worked for him. Since then, rates have dropped significantly, right? I mean, even owner financing, you might be able to get down to 5 or something like that. I've never gone back to negotiate with him. And I think that's part of the relationship thing too, is he still finances that property for me. I've looked at refinancing it. You refinance though, it's going to be a 25-year am, and you have the bank, and it's pretty expensive actually to refinance, and all that stuff. And he likes it and I like it. So we're just kind of rolling. At some point I'll likely refinance, and I'll give him a heads up and stuff before I do. But yeah, I mean, I think it just worked for him. I mean, he liked those two numbers. Those were the ones he keyed on. I could tell was the purchase price and the interest rate. And so I'm paying a high interest rate, but it works. I mean, if it's worked into the math and you're cash flowing, I'm fine with it.
Yeah, and I think people get tied up, just my personal opinion, on interest rates too much. Now, don't get me wrong, interest rates can make a difference, right? But in this scenario, if you're paying a 5.7, what does it matter? Because the tenants are paying, you're not paying that interest rates, right? If you're paying a lower rent, okay, you'd be making more cash flow, but it's the tenants that are paying that. It's not coming out of your pockets, essentially. And you've got into a great deal, right? You've got into $1 million property with 35K down, right? Over a 40-year am, and you're paying a 5.7 interest rate. But the interest rate is so irrelevant to some extent. If you're cash flowing great and it makes sense, what does it matter? I pay an 8, 9, 10% interest rate if it makes sense, right? If it makes sense in the deal and you're getting what you want. So I think that's such an important lesson there. It's like, yes, it's a higher interest rate, 5.7, but really what you're gaining is way bigger and way more important than anything related to that interest rate.
Oh, totally agree. Yeah, I mean, we can even dive into numbers. I'm an open book.
Okay.
Too,
yeah. So, yeah, please do.
Yeah, I mean, so more or less the mortgage, there's some fees and stuff. It's because I have a company who's helping with the mortgage. That's the other thing, that like there's a mortgage office in town that will truly like take my payment and send it to him, and then they'll track it and they'll send a tax info at the end of the year, and it costs me $8 a month. I mean, it's super, super worth it. So I would encourage people, if they're doing an owner finance thing, maybe try and find a service like that, because I don't have to do any of that legwork. but the payment is around $5,200 a month, which again, $5,000 a month payment sounded like a ton, right? But now that we're fully built out and fully rented, everything rents for about $8,300 a month. And the taxes are about $1,000 a year. Taxes are just super, super cheap here. And then the insurance is pretty cheap as well. So ultimately, all told, everything in, we're cash flowing probably $1,500-$1,600 a month, on a $35,000 down thing. And I did put some money into fixing it up. So I would say we're probably close to that $100,000 into it at the moment. But still, you start looking at ROI and it looks pretty good.
Yeah, you're probably talking 18% cash on cash or something like that.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like I've never actually such a math person. I've never done the math. I still am a little bit in disbelief, I suppose, on this one. It's our money, right? If it's investor money, I'm I'll dial it down to the penny. But if it's ours, I could be a little bit more loosey goosey and just say, yeah, this thing's working, and we're blessed and lucky to have it.
Well, that's the thing, right? When it's a great deal, it's all right, it's a great deal. I don't need to calculate it, right? I've got this great cash flow coming in every month and it's working out. What do you think the value of that is now, out of interest?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think true value at the moment is about 1.4, maybe 1.5. Again, the market's helped us. The market here has just gone crazy. It kind of emulates the California market where we live. And so, the appreciation alone, and we've only owned it for 2.5 years, or no, just around 2 years, actually. The appreciation alone has been incredible. So you asked the question, how did I know it is valued? Zillow said at the time it was 1.1. Tax assessment was around $1 million, which is usually pretty low. So I knew the value was there. And I did ask a couple of realtors, hey, if you had to sell this property, what would it be worth? And they all agreed it was worth more than $1 million. So when we purchased it, we had kind of instant equity built in too. So that's kind of the multiple things about real estate. There's so many levers, right? It's you get the cash flow, appreciation, tax benefits, all the stuff. And this is a really good case study to show that it works.
Yeah, sounds like an awesome deal, man. And no doubt that it is, right? Getting all the equity, getting the cash flow. But looking back, if you were to do something different on this deal, what would you do differently, you think? Is there anything?
Yeah, I probably would have started with a property manager managing it earlier on, because I managed it myself. I was just trying to save some money, and I learned some lessons and stuff. But what I would have done earlier is just let them manage it. There'd be times where maybe I needed to jump in and fix the boiler thing. That took me kind of just doing it, right? But I think a good lesson would be, as soon as you can possibly afford it, hire some of the stuff out. I should have done that earlier. Again, it's kind of hard to look back and say I would have changed some stuff because it's gone pretty well. But that one for sure. I think a good property manager is worth their weight in gold.
Yeah, very cool, man. And it's cool to hear these stories as well of people actually doing it. Like you said, a case study and a deep dive into it, because, you hear of owner financing here and there and okay, that sounds good, but does it really happen? I think, I always hear people say that and they're very skeptical of it happening. Well, no, this is a great example of buying $1 million property with $35,000 down, right? You couldn't, what would 20% get you? It would get you 170.
Yeah, exactly. It just wouldn't have got me anything, right?
Yeah, so yeah, cool. Well, congratulations on that awesome deal. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it, man. And thank you for being here for this 2-part series. It's been, I've really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed talking to you, getting to know you and hear what you've done. But before we go, can you tell us a little bit more about your podcast? And then if someone wants to reach out and get in touch with you, how can they do so?
Yeah, again, thanks, Barry, for having me. Same thing. I've really enjoyed chatting, getting to know you. It's been awesome to be on. So my podcast is called The Real Estate Mindset. You can find it on iTunes or my website. Website is wildoakcapital.com, and you can find me there, and you can find all the social media stuff there as well. So just cruise there and check it out.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, man. Have an awesome rest of your day out there in Colorado.
All right. Thanks, Barry. Good to talk.